Good afternoon. This will be the last time I say that to you all. I hope you guys had a good time. Anybody? Yeah. And now it's my distinct pleasure. We have a very special guest. He's a longtime friend of mine. He's one of the leaders in the field. He's an internationally desired speaker, and he's limiting his speaking engagements, so we're really very fortunate to have him joining us. And he's a very modest guy, so before I embarrass him anymore, but let me just tell you a couple of things about him. You must know about him, but just in case, Jerimiah Grossman is the founder and CEO of BitDiscovery. He's the chief of security strategy at SentinelOne, professional hacker, black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Don't mess with him. But he's got the huge heart, and he's a really nice guy, though, so don't worry about it. And he's the founder of White Hat Security, right? You guys must have heard about them and what they recently have had happen, which is good. His career spans nearly 20 years. And he's lived a literal lifetime in computer security to become one of the industry's biggest names, and he certainly has. He has spoken for us in the past. And without further ado, let's give a really warm LA welcome to Jerimiah Grossman.
Thank you. Afternoon, everybody. Richard, thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. So, yeah, Richard and I have been friends for over 10 years. I've been coming to these events for over a decade. And as Richard mentioned, I don't do public presentations much. I've given over 400 public presentations in my career on 6 continents, and I've slowed it down in the last couple of years, not the least of which I'm enjoying my island paradise in Hawaii. So when a conference organizer calls me up, I'll say thank you for the opportunity, but what would it take for you to leave Hawaii and put on shoes? So if you see me on stage somewhere, I must really like for some reason. And so before going on, I just want to, I'm standing between you and your weekend right now. So thank you for hanging out to the end of the conference and listening to what I have to say. But also, thank you for the organizers for putting this on. This is no small feat what these volunteers have to do to put together an event for everybody like this, and it's a really great thing. So, yeah, so you guys heard about my background. I've been doing application security for, how do we fix this? How do we fix this here? For about 20 years now. Let's see, go forward. There we go. And mostly was application security, but I moved into something called asset inventory. Well, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. But after 20 years of doing information security, why do I do this and why do I continue doing this? And it's actually more like a personal calling than anything else. I really don't like when people get hacked and taken advantage of. That's what I try to prevent, people from having a really bad day, and I personally know what that's like. I've had, my computers hacked. I've had to personally pay extortion money, to Russians and things like that. So I know what what that means, and I don't wish that to happen to anybody else. At least I can help it. So we're going to talk a lot about application security. So now that White Hat is sold, I haven't been an application security vendor personally because I moved past White Hat about 3 years ago. So I get to help you guys take a different look at application security. I might actually commit some application security heresy here. And I'll help you how to ask your vendors really uncomfortable yet important questions. So we'll get into all that, but my day job right now is all asset inventory. In my personal opinion, the largest and most important unsolved problem we have in InfoSec is that no one knows what they own. Not their websites, not their mail servers, not their domain names. They don't know what they have in the cloud. They know absolutely nothing. And as we like to say, you cannot secure what you don't know you own. Solving that problem, and everybody has tried to solve it, and everybody has failed. Every vendor, every engineer. That's why the best anybody has as far as asset inventory goes is an Excel spreadsheet someplace. So that ends up being my #1 competitor, Microsoft Excel. So we're making our way in the world. So if you're interested in that type of product, you can talk to me about it later. I'm going to tell you a little bit of background on the vulnerability assessment industry. So how do we get this to go away, the top thing? There we go. So I used to sell vulnerabilities for a living. Companies used to come to us, large and small, says, please test my websites for vulnerabilities. And the idea being that we will find your vulnerabilities, you fix them, and you have a less likelihood of getting hacked. Now, as a vendor, when a customer comes to me and they're looking at a White Hat, a Veracode, or whoever else, right? How do we win the deal? How do we impress you so you'll buy us versus someone else? And this process is extremely important for every customer in the room to understand. As a vendor, we are highly incentivized to find and report every single vulnerability in the system we possibly can. And we will spend millions in R&D every single year to be just that much better at what we do. So we're going to report every single issue. So you know those giant plates of red that you get from the vendors? That's us. And the reason we have to do that is because when you're comparing two discrete products, you're probably going to go with the one that finds the most high severity issues over the one that even found just one or two less. You're going to want the ones that don't miss anything. Even if the vulnerabilities are so esoteric and difficult to exploit that it makes us look really cool, then there's no chance of anybody else finding and actually exploiting, you're going to pick that one. That's just the way it lines up. So that's what the vendor wants to do. We want to drop everything on you. Customer, or you conversely, you only want the vulnerabilities that matter, the ones that are likely to get you hacked. Everything else that we find and report is a giant waste of time. And you're going to have to try to get some developer to fix it, and he's going to go, that's a giant waste of time. No one's ever going to find that. No one's ever going to do anything with that. So that is the misalignment of interest between vendor and consumer. Now, I was told that the AV isn't working quite right, so I'll have to navigate through these a little bit. That chart right there, that chart, the way to read it is, in, let's say, the third one down, cross-site scripting, that says there that comes from White Hat's latest statistics report, the 2017 data in their 2018 report. That means 37 or 38% of the sites they looked at had least one or more cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in them. So that's how the chart lines up. So the number and types of vulnerabilities that websites have is rather large. So that's some great data there. And there's a lot of reports out there in the industry with statistics. So let's move forward. I'm just going to have to navigate this. This is the raw number of vulnerabilities. So these are, the light blue are serious. The other ones is all the other vulnerabilities. So for instance, the retail industry on an annualized basis has around 5.7 vulnerabilities identified per year in the average retail website. So keep those numbers in mind, just relative range. Somewhere between 0 and 10 is the average number of serious vulnerabilities a website is likely to have. Now, those numbers that White Hat produces, man, this is terrible. Those numbers that White Hat produces are not unique to White Hat. This one's from the Veracode report. I'll show you down here. Veracode, their most recent one, volume 9. The numbers here are the years. So it's same numbers. Information leakage, about 66% or so in 2018. So same likelihood numbers. Veracode's numbers roughly mirror White Hat's. Now, we have to look at this in terms of scale. We do web security here. So when you're looking at data, you know, the statistics from one company is nice, it's important to them, but we work on web security, and the web is really big. Right now, as it stands, there's roughly 1.3 billion websites on the internet, according to Netcraft. So now, just keep this in mind. Let's say the average website has 5 vulnerabilities per year. 5 times 1.3 billion. That's how many vulnerabilities that we haven't found yet, or thereabouts. So think about it in terms of remediation. Is anybody really thinking we're going to go back and rewrite all that code to fix all that stuff? No, it's just not going to happen. So we're going to have to deal with this stuff in a different way, in terms of scale and business process. Here's where the numbers get even a little bit more sobering. We have found an issue. We know what it is. We know what it can do. We've communicated to the company, and now it's their job to fix it. The VA vendors, we can't fix anything. We can just tell you all the things that you do wrong. You have to fix it. So when the issue's fixed, you do a retest, and the time between the 2 points is your time to fix. So on critical vulnerabilities, The average, the critical, worst of the worst, like SQL injection, you're going to get owned. You're going to be in the Verizon data breach report. The average time to fix is 139 days from the time of report. 139 days, right? That's what we're looking at. All right. Now, here's another way to look at it. Window of exposure. This is actually one of my favorite metrics. It's just a little weird. How many vulnerabilities does the bad guy or the adversary need to exploit in order to win? 1. Okay. Window of exposure means whether it's a SQL injection, cross-site scripting vulnerability, or whatever, how many days of the year you had at least one remotely exploitable critical vulnerability. If it's not SQL injection, it'd be cross-site scripting or something else. So the way to read this is let's say, let me get a little closer here on my screen. You won't be able to see it. The manufacturing industry, see the blue lines, the tall lines? That's the number of sites that had at least one known remotely exploitable vulnerability every single day of the year, which is most of them. So a lot of owns. They take a long time to fix, and there's always one that still remains that you can exploit. What are the remediation rates? So you found an issue. How often do they get fixed? Because remember, you only get a time to fix metric when you fix something. So the critical vulnerabilities on the dynamically found vulns, if I say the word dynamic testing, does most everybody know what that means? Do you have dynamic, static, runtime testing? Anyway, half the vulnerabilities that you find with DAST ever get fixed. The other half don't. Think about that. We have a massive number of vulnerabilities. They take 139 days to fix, and we only fix half of them. That's a lot of vulnerabilities. It's a lot of greenfield territory for the bad guys to do whatever they want. This is a graph from Veracode that parses it down a little bit more. They parse it down. So 25% of their findings are fixed within 21 days. 50% are fixed within 121 days. And 75% are fixed within 472 days. Their data is not terribly dissimilar. So I've looked at Veracode, Trustwave, HP, IBM. All the data roughly is within the same range. Now, here's the big question. Well, now we know that all these vulnerabilities exist. We know the customers know they exist. We know the bad guys know they exist. The big question is, after 20 years, or let's say the last 10 years in web security, why aren't they exploited? Yeah, we know websites get hacked, and we know, yes, there's data breaches, but there's 1.3 billion websites on the planet. It doesn't seem to make rational sense why so few are actually compromised, why so few are actually hacked. How many websites were going to be hacked last year? 10,000, 100,000, a million? It certainly wasn't anywhere near 1.3 billion. So why are these serious vulnerabilities that we vendors are reporting to you not leveraged? We'll go through some theories. So here's some plausible theories. Some ideas are going to be different than others. They are not really vulnerabilities in the directly remotely exploitable sense. We're just saying they are because you'll believe it. Perhaps they are too difficult for attackers to find and exploit. That's entirely possible. They are only exploitable by insiders, maybe with access to the source code or whatever. There's not enough attackers to exploit all of them. Maybe there's, just like there's a shortage of InfoSec professionals, there's actually a shortage of adversaries. That's possible. There are more attractive targets to exploit, or maybe they don't always want to go through the web app. Maybe they want to send you an email that you'll click on. Maybe, and that's the last one here, they are being exploited, but we don't know about it yet. That's entirely possible. So these are some of the reasons that we can noodle through on why these vulnerabilities aren't taken advantage of. So this is what I mentioned earlier. 9 times out of 10, the vendor who produces the best results in terms of high severity vulnerabilities with the lowest false positives will win your business. As such, every vendor is highly incentivized to identify as many vulnerabilities as they possibly can to demonstrate their skill and overall value. And we invest millions collectively every single year to do that. All right, now, we'll keep all that in mind. Now let's break down DAST, Dynamic Application Security Testing, where we test the website or the web application at runtime, and we detect certain behaviors that might elicit certain vulnerabilities. Now, here is my conjecture. Why do we do DAST at all as the fundamental concept? Like, what is the core value prop? And feel free to disagree with me, but my premise is DAST is used for testing in production, and its business value is to find and help you fix the vulnerabilities before an attacker finds and exploits them. That's the race. Everybody generally agree with that statement? That's why we do that production testing? Okay, great. Hold that in mind. Now, here's the thing. Where are all the breaches that could or should be happening? If attackers really aren't finding, exploiting, or even caring about these vulnerabilities that I just went through, as we can infer from the supplied data, what's the value in discovering them or even looking for them if the bad guys don't care about them? It's a gigantic waste of time and money. If so, then all those vulnerabilities that DAST is finding rarely matter much, and we're collectively wasting precious time and resources focusing on them because we have a misalignment of interest in the market. All right, let's leave DAST behind for a moment, and let's move on to static analysis. Actually, let's do a quick show of hands. How many people here are familiar with, have used dynamic tools or services? Okay, great. Down, and static analysis, same question? Okay, cool. All right. Now, what is then the business value prop of doing static analysis at all? Why do it? What is the one reason, the main reason you do this stuff? This will be my premise. It's predominantly meant to find vulnerabilities during the SDLC before they land in production, where they'll eventually be found by a DAST vendor and exploited by, or DAST vendor and or exploited by attackers. We want to find them earlier in the SDLC. SAST is meant to find the vulnerabilities that DAST will find earlier. Is that a reasonable assumption? Great. So the question then becomes, right there, what's the overlap between DAST and SAST? What's the vulnerability overlap between the two? So meaning, I'm going to give you a blank chart here. There's three types of vulnerabilities we care about. There's all the ones that vulns that DAST finds, and would you generally agree that the adversary generally uses DAST to find an exploit over static analysis because they don't have source code? Yeah. So the ones that we generally care about are the DAST vulns, because that represents the production risk. Then we have this other pool of all the vulnerabilities that SAST finds in the SDLC, but there's this one that we have to talk about here. These are the vulnerabilities that the adversary finds and exploits, and that's not necessarily the same thing. What we're trying to do here is create a Venn diagram between these worlds. Does it seem reasonable? Okay. So, for those, so one last question. For those that have run, who has run DAST and SAST together, has run both? Okay. So you'll have to help me out here to the extent that you can. When you've run these tools side by side, in your personal experience, what is the overlap between the two? Meaning, they found the exact same vulnerability. Is it 5% overlap, 90% overlap, somewhere in between? What have you found? 30 to 40? Okay. There's hands over here.
About 50.
About 50? Fantastic. Okay. Good. We'll leave that there. I'm going to give you my biased vendor point of view. I run both, and other people may disagree and have different experience. This is what my chart would look like. The size of the bubbles here indicate the total number of vulnerabilities. So in my experience, the number of findings that SAST produces is significantly bigger than dynamic, than the blue. The overlap between the blue and the green, SAST and DAST, in my experience, has only been 5 to 15%. Then the red is predominantly found within the blue and a little bit in the green. And I left, you notice there, a little bit outside that are found by neither because there are false negatives. The tools are not perfect. Now, I think it's between 5 and 15%. You don't have to believe me. But one of the things I'll point you to, because I've recently downloaded over the years every single application statistics report out there, please tell me which one of them has a vulnerability overlap statistic. It does not exist in the industry. So going back to the core principles, what is DAS for? What is SAS for? They're meant to overlap. But there's not one report in the entire industry by any vendor that measures it. It's extremely suspicious. It's not like they don't have the data. They do. And the data says these tools do not overlap. So here's a couple of questions here. So in the blue, the ones that the red doesn't find, why do we even bother? Like, that's a gigantic waste of time and money. We don't need to fix those. We don't even need to find them or even look for them. The ones in the green, you know, SAS is even worse. They give you this gigantic plate of stuff, and you really don't know what all these things are, nor are they really production risks. So here's the thing, and this is where I'll catch flack, I'm sure. I'm used to it on Twitter. Is what if this is true? If this is the world, the concept is true. We would love to find these vulnerabilities early with static analysis, only the technology doesn't actually fulfill that vision. It's a giant smoke and mirrors game, right? So next time you start testing these tools and vendors are soliciting you, go ask them what the vulnerability correlation rate is within their own products and see if they know or would be willing to tell you. You'll watch the sales guy like squirm like in this, and their sales engineer will be even worse. So that's what I mentioned. I can't find a single report. And here's where you see a litmus test. So let me give you some more numbers. Information security as a broad market is reported to be about $120 billion annually, growing at 5 to 7% per year. Okay? Cyber insurance, which we're rarely exposed to in our industry because cybersecurity products and services are bought by CISOs, cyber insurance is bought by CFOs, and the CISO isn't invited to the party. Imagine. Cyber insurance right now is roughly $4 to $5 billion in premiums, growing over the last 4 years at 40 to 60% per year. It's growing much, much faster. The business is signaling to us that they're tired of giving us more and more budget dollars, and they're putting more and more towards insurance because they're just figuring we're going to get hacked anyway. Now, if you've ever applied for cyber insurance, they'll give you this big 50-point questionnaire, and I've gone through the cycles of like 50 different carriers, and I've checked all the different boxes to try to figure out their pricing algorithms. Turns out after they ask you, are you PCI compliant, do you run Windows, do you have AV, none of that stuff matters. They actually don't even care. The only 3 questions that matter are the size of your organization in terms of revenue, the number of records you have that they'll have to pay out on later, and the industry that you're in. They do not care about your security posture. Not at all because they're negligent or incompetent. They actually have all the data anyway. They know your security posture really doesn't matter with all these tools in terms of losses. So here's where it comes down to, and this is where it breaks the brain of the standard InfoSec professional. Exploitation of a vulnerability does not automatically result in a data breach, and a data breach does not necessarily equate to a material business loss. And a loss, financial loss, is the only thing the business or your carrier will care about. They don't care if you're running dynamic, static, AV, or anything else. There are only 3 questions that matter on the average InfoSec policy. So they're writing policies at a breakneck pace, even though they know you don't know all where your websites are, even though they know you're riddled with vulns, they still don't care because none of the stuff actually matters. Sorry, I don't bring good news for you guys. I never do that. I'm a fear merchant. That's what I do. All right, let's go back here. All right. So what are some of the lessons learned? We'll get into a couple other things real quick. It's clear to me we're wasting a huge amount of time, money, and energy finding and fixing vulnerabilities that rarely matter. We need a better way to prioritize and justify remediation or not of the vulnerabilities we already know exist and should care about. And we must more efficiently invest our resources in the application security testing process. Less is more in this case. We got to stop going from more is more and go into less is more and be much more focused, because the business isn't just going to give us double the money to find more vulnerabilities that we're not going to get fixed. They're just not going to do that. So vulnerability remediation. All right, so now let's risk model this a little bit, because we're going to have to figure out which vulns to fix and not fix, and we're going to do some very contrived examples here. So let's take some assumptions here. And many of you might be familiar with just the age-old risk model. Probability of a breach multiplied by the expected loss, or the probability of a breach multiplied by the expected loss gives you a risk in financial terms. Let's say we're dealing with a SQL injection vulnerability in a non-authenticated portion of a web app. It has a 50% likelihood of being exploited because it's non-authenticated over a year period of time. We're just going to pick some funny numbers to illustrate the point. If exploited and it results in a material breach, the expected loss is $1 million. We chose $1 million because that's what the Verizon DBR says is like the median loss or something like that for incident handling and cleanup. So now let's apply our math. $1 million in expected loss times a 50% probability of a breach equals $500,000 in risk. Here's how the decision making works. If the vulnerability costs less than $500,000 to fix, then that is the reasonable choice. If the remediation costs more than $500,000, then it might actually be reasonable to leave it as is. And I can't imagine why fixing a SQL injection vuln will cost $500,000. All right. Now, let's go the other extreme. Let's say we have the expected loss of $500,000, same figure, but the probability of a breach is only 1%, which seems closer to reality. Then the business is only taking on $5,000 of risk in that particular equation. This is why likelihood of exploitation matters a great deal, and it's the one data point that we don't have a good handle on in the industry. That's why I like the Verizon DBR, because we get closer to that world. Now, if this particular vulnerability costs less than $5,000 to fix, then it makes sense to fix it. If it's more or far more, then one could argue it makes business sense to leave it as is. So now you guys heard the resistance from the business before. So you bring up vulnerabilities to them of some kind. You give it to a development manager. And here's how the business works it through. I can fix a vulnerability that may get exploited, that may be found, may be exploited, and may have some financial ramifications. Or I can take those development resources to continue pushing new features out the door that if they don't go out, if these new features don't go out, we know for sure we're going to suffer a business loss because the feature isn't there. Which one do you do? So that right there is the core reason why vulnerabilities are not fixed, because revenue-generating features are more of a sure thing. So until we can actually measure the likelihood of exploitation and the financial risk, we're going to get blank stares at us, and the remediation rates will still be at 50% no matter what we do. All right. So
the idea that the business owners are already they know this.
They know this better than we do.
And they're just doing the math in their head.
Yeah.
Right.
So he's going, well, you're telling me about this SQL injection vuln, and I really don't know what that is. And you're telling me bad things might happen. But I know if I don't push this feature, I know what will happen. All right. Now, in InfoSec, this is our position which we can't have. If your position is recommending that the business should fix each and every vulnerability immediately, regardless of the cost, then you're really not on the side of the business, and you will continue to be ignored. There's just no way around this simple fact. Who here has experienced this? Everybody, probably. Okay. So now, here's the question. Here's where it makes every InfoSec person uncomfortable. Which vulnerabilities should we never fix? Does anyone ever want to answer that question? I gave you 100 high-severity vulnerabilities. Please tell me which ones we should not fix. Just imagine that for a moment. We we kind of bristle at that. We never want to give anybody that answer. But we're going to have to get really comfortable doing that because the business is already doing it without us.
The one that won't be exploited.
Which one is that? And also remember, we're up against, when I talk to my friends and family, my experience too, they'll say, I got hacked, almost like it's an act of nature. Right? It just happened to me like a tornado or a volcano or whatever. Right? I have to explain to them that no, you didn't just get hacked like an act of nature. There's somebody probably in Russia that has just put strange software on your computer and is monitoring your email. And all of a sudden their whole world changes. There's actually now a person in their machine, which is really more indicative of what it is. All right. So how do we do vulnerability remediation? How do we play this game in our world? So it's almost like you guys have read, you've seen all the dashboards in security proxy service like I have, and we have this affinity for red, yellow, green, right? So now imagine if we took the red, yellow, green traffic light system and we applied it to InfoSec like we're meant to, right? The light is green because in most places where you put this light, it makes sense to be green. But we're not taking into account anything about the current street situation, location, or traffic patterns. What's a high-severity SQL injection for one company is not necessarily a high-severity SQL injection for another company. Again, to make it more real-world, just because that traffic light is green over there doesn't mean we should make one green over there. You got to take more into account than that, like context. Should you trust that the light has your best... Testing my patience. So, should you trust that light has your best interest at heart? No, probably not. Should you obey it anyway? Yes, because once you install something like that, you end up having to follow it no matter how stupid it is. So that's InfoSec in a nutshell. So we also need remediation alternatives. And I know there's many, people have strongly held opinions on these things, but clearly if we're going to increase our remediation rates, we're not going to fix all the code. There just isn't more developers in the world. An infinite number of developers in the world, obviously. So we have to look at things like web application firewalls, RASP technology, and whether we can debate today how good or bad they are today, but the fact of the matter is whether or not they work today is almost immaterial. We actually need them to work. We actually need more and better options to remediate vulnerabilities faster and easier than just fixing the code, which is just not a business and fiscal reality. We're going to need other ways. All right. There's one more piece of conventional wisdom I'd like to blow up today, or at least get you to think differently about. You've heard this one. Finding or fixing vulnerabilities in the SDLC is 50, 100, whatever times cheaper than waiting till production. Right? You guys heard this one. Fixing, and it comes from fixing bugs, not necessarily vulnerabilities. Fixing bugs earlier in the SDLC, in the SDL, is 100 times cheaper, and there's studies on this. And the application security world has borrowed that because they go, vulnerability, well, that's just like a bug, so we take this over. Now, that model, it's many, many times cheaper to fix in development. While true, you should never, ever use this argument, and I'll explain to you why. Even if it's true, you should never, ever use it. So let's go from data. Let's assume the average website has 10 vulnerabilities per year. We went through the data. It's vaguely accurate. Some may or may not disagree with me on the second bullet. Let's assume each vulnerability requires 10 man-hours to remediate, to understand the issue, to code up a fix, push it to the source code repository, QA, regression, and push. Is 10 engineering hours a reasonable estimate? Average SQL injection, average cross-site scripting, is that somewhat reasonable? Okay, more or less. Now, let's just say it's $200 an hour for an engineer's hour. So let's do the math. On the average website, you have 10 vulns times 10 hours of fix time times $200 an hour. That means your vulnerability remediation debt on an annualized basis is $20,000. That's the most you're going to save the business by going security in the SDLC is cheaper. Your most you're ever going to save the business is 20 grand. So now, you have that 20 grand in outstanding debt. Now, what does this AppSec person say you have to do or buy to make sure those vulnerabilities didn't happen in the first place and be cheaper? You got to buy DAS tools, you got to buy training, you got to buy SaaS tools, right? Is it going to be more or less than 20 grand? Way more. right? And the dev manager already does this math real fast, right? He just is not telling us about it, right? He goes, that's why they don't do these things in the SDL in terms of cost. That is a losing money proposition. So while it is, and very well could be, 10 times cheaper to fix vulns earlier or to not have them in the first place, the business does not care. You're not saving them enough money. So what you really should be doing is taking a more risk approach. And now, what we risk here is not that it's cheaper to fix earlier, it's that if you get hacked, then you're going to lose $1 million. So we have to think in terms of like risk and consequence of getting breached, not that it's cheaper to fix earlier. All right. Let's go through the last bullet points, and we'll wrap this up. Maybe get into a little Q&A here. We have to know what types of vulnerabilities we care about in terms of actual business risk and financial loss. The value to an adversary of content spoofing is nowhere near the same as SQL injection or cross-site scripting, but we treat them all in terms of the same in terms of severity. We need to prioritize the investment. The money that we have must be prioritized to only look for those things that we care about and ignore all the other worthless junk. We have to be able to do this. Now, and here's the reason why we have to be more effective with our money. I think in InfoSec, it's not a budget size problem. I think $120 billion is probably sufficient. Maybe we'll keep going up, but I think it's sufficient. I think we have a spending efficacy problem. We spend an extraordinary amount of money on things that simply don't matter, that simply don't work. So for instance, how much time and money would we guess it would take an adversary to break into basically any company, the average company? Maybe a week, maybe a month, maybe 10 grand, maybe 20 grand in time and money. You know, somewhere in there, maybe as high as 50 will get you into most places, right? Now, let's say $50,000. That's what the bad guy is going to invest to compromise you. This take 50 grand and you give it to a CISO or the security team to buy something. What does that buy you? It buys you absolutely nothing. So the thing is that the bad guys have to spend like 100 times less than you have to spend on defense. Your $1 million is beat by $10,000 of theirs. We have to close that gap. So I think we have a more spending efficacy issue than a budget issue, unless we want to continue spending 100 times more than what the adversaries are. That's just a losing game, and we're going to lose that eventually. Actually, we lost it a long time ago. So bulky vulnerability assessment reports will be, if we prioritize better, will likely be dramatically decreased in size and increased in value, which should make all you happy. No more big plates of vuln reports that don't matter. All right. So where's the edge of knowledge in this place, where some of you here can put in your creativity and your engineering time? With our matrix of vulnerability remediation must take into account that each vulnerability class aligns with the likelihood of an actual exploitation using whatever available data we have, and contains an expected loss range. I want to know if you report a SQL injection vulnerability, what its likelihood of exploitation is, and should it get exploited, how much money I'd be set to lose. And now all of a sudden we're actually having a more mature conversation with the business on why we should fix any of these. Until we get that time, we're going to be stuck with red, green, yellow, red. Then we have to take into account the authentication status of the vulnerability, any mitigating controls, the industry, resident data volume and type, and then insider versus external threat actor, and so on, as much as we can about how do we exploit this vulnerability. Because a SQL injection vulnerability, in terms of likelihood of exploitation, if one has auth and one does not, it dramatically changes the likelihood of exploitation. But when is the last time you've seen any dashboard of any product take that into account? I mean, that's an easy one. They don't take that into account. So this is the last slide I'm going to show you here. Do some parting words. There's a couple of different groups in the industry that are really closely looking at vulnerability remediation. How do we reprioritize? One was done by the Scientia Institute. Is based on data from Kenna Security, and they go into the world of CVEs and exploit code and patch rates, and they give you an idea that one of the things they said, in terms of exploitation, a likelihood of exploitation, this will boggle the mind. If you looked at the highest severity CVEs, what they say are the most, it is a coin flip in terms of effectiveness over just randomness of fixing whatever you have. They're actually, the way that CVE prioritizes it means absolutely nothing in terms of limiting your actual likelihood of exploitation. You could just guess and you'll do better than CVEs. And then there's also other reports that patching all these things may not matter. One of the lessons you learn in that run is they recommend that rather than, everybody's always trying to patch faster, but what seems to be happening is that the bad guys are using vulnerabilities that are 12 to 18 months old or thereabouts. We don't actually need to patch faster. We have to patch more broadly and more consistently. We're only patching like 80% of the systems at a CVE kind of thing. If we patch all 100% of them in 3 months, then we'd be in a much better place. So they look for patch consistency because the bad guys aren't going straight from published vulnerability in most cases to actual exploitation. There's a time gap there. All right, so I've blown up some conventional wisdom. I'll go here. But AppSec is not a solved problem. It's going to continue growing. Here's another way to look at the world. When I left White Hat, I was running into these problems where we would find tons of vulnerabilities in the average customer, all the stats reports you'll see. But I wanted to know what percentage of our customers' websites we were actually covering. On the average, for all the customers, we were only covering 10 to 20% of their websites on average. They actually did not want us to cover the other 80% because they already couldn't fix the vulnerabilities we told them about. So why would they ever want 8 times more of what we gave them at 8 times the price for issues that they're never going to fix? So until we solve this remediation issue, we're not even going to test the rest of the web because there is no rational reason to. So that's where the edge of knowledge is. So if you want to really help the cause in AppSec, do some innovation, this is where you look. We're really good at finding vulnerabilities. We're really terrible at fixing them and prioritizing remediation. So that's where you get involved. And I'll give you one more story on that one. So just back to bit discovery for a moment. There was a breach. I can't tell you the name, but there was one of the mega breaches, right? And it was due to someone not patching a known vulnerability. And we looked at their inventory and looked and said, yeah, they didn't patch that vulnerability, got exploited in that system. We know that. Somebody forgot to hit the patch. But we noticed they actually did patch that same vulnerability on a bunch of other systems. So we called them up and go, like, you patched the same issue over here, but not over there. Why? And they went, that's a really interesting question. Yes, somebody didn't patch that system, but they would have had they known that website existed in the first place. So back I go to asset inventory and why I'm continuing to do this. So with that, thank you very much for your time. Have a great evening. And I guess Q&A if you want to.
Okay, so great talk, by the way, and thank you for coming all the way out from Hawaii to talk to us. Did you consider damage to reputation and some of the other risks? The first question. So there are maybe some other risks that count to brand reputation and so on and so forth that don't directly translate to a monetary loss, and that's what some of the people are considering. Yeah. And the second question is, how do you think, because I know you thought about this, we could solve the problem of getting a more accurate list of vulnerabilities that are going to be exploited?
Sure. So yeah, great question. So let's go. Let's call reputational risks soft costs, and hard losses are like fines, lawsuits, system downtime. Those would be more of the hard losses. I'm more familiar with hard losses because the insurance companies and the companies themselves report it. In fact, cyber insurance doesn't even cover the soft costs like reputational damage. And have you ever seen those reports in the industry like the breaches from InfoSec cost the economies of the world like $1 trillion, right? They get to those numbers by including very broad, wild guess estimates on reputational damage. Actually, no one has those numbers. So when I look at cyber insurance, I actually call BS on all those statistics, to be perfectly honest. There's about $4 to $5 billion in premiums being paid, let's say just last year. I struggle to find the loss data to even get the losses to $1 billion. in claims paid back. So to let you understand what this means, so let's say you're looking at property and casualty insurance. The margins that the insurance companies have on something as large as property and casualty is like 3 to 5%. In cyber, it's 30. They're just going to write policies. They'll write policies all day long because they know their losses aren't going to be there. Now, the only way that I found to calculate reputational harm is with a metric that I got from the eBay PayPal guys like 10 or 15 years ago called indirect hard loss. They looked at what the average transaction volume of an unhacked customer was, and they just put it as X. And what they did was when there was an account takeover, somebody's account would be compromised, their money would be stolen, they would be defrauded, it would be a bad experience, and they would make the customer whole again. The customer wouldn't necessarily leave. Its customer is not like yes or no, but they would transact a certain amount less than the average customer who was never hacked. So let's say, I don't remember what the number was, but let's say they transact 30% less across 100,000 hacked accounts. That was their indirect hard loss that they would then calculate. So you can say reputational harm, fine, but I don't think it's the same across breaches and across companies. Every company must calculate it their own way. And then what the second question was? The
second question was, how do you think we could look at
Oh, yeah. So
Can you repeat it?
Yeah. How do we find the vulnerabilities that we should be finding and fixing? The two data sources I would look at would be the Verizon data breach report, whatever vulnerabilities that they're saying that the bad guys are taking advantage of, and there's really just one, SQL injection, and you can say some of the PHP remotes would be the second one, and then the breach data from the cyber insurance carriers, which are starting to release. They have lots of incident data on what happened. So what the cyber insurance companies are doing, they're actually buying actuarial data. They're taking in your questionnaire on your IT environment, and they're waiting for the breaches to happen to figure out what matters in security. Does it really matter if somebody has AV or not, or firewalls or not, or if they patch certain speeds or not? So give them a few years, and they're going to have more accurate, actionable data than in the next few years than InfoSec would ever have given them in the last 30, because they're going to have all the breach data.
We've got some one here.
One of the unfortunate things is that as valid as what you're saying is true, due to regulations, we still have to do these things.
Oh, yeah.
And so, I mean, I guess we could work on the consortium to change this, but what would you, how would you work to address it?
I like regulation when it comes to enforcing liability. You will be liable should something bad happen. I don't like prescriptive regulation because if you look at how the bad guys operate, they change their tactics all the time because they're sentient. So prescriptive regulations that maybe you get updated every 3 years are doomed to fail. The bad guys are going to go right past that. So yes, prescriptive regulations are actually going to be more costly and painful than doing absolutely nothing because they tie up our resources elsewhere. Look at the data in these reports from the retail industry. PCI had actually zero effect on anything. Just look at the data. I mean, are the retailers getting hacked less often now? Are they less vulnerable? If they are, I can't see it in the data.
Thanks. I like this pragmatic, realistic approach. Question is, can you take this discussion and approach and extend it for the case of the ISV who is writing packaged software that's going to be used by 1,000 customers, let's say, such that if there's a vulnerability that gets exploited, it might affect, instead of one organization, it could affect 1,000 organizations, and that could truly wipe out the ISV. But have you guys thought about that?
There's a little bit, I'll think about those things, but it comes, I think the term you're probably looking for is software security supply chain, and giving your suppliers of software some kind of standards, and that's actually picking up the pace, but not always in terms of security so much. It's that all of a sudden your shoddy software, I have to apply financial resources to patch your shoddy software. And when you multiply that out by 1,000 companies, and that cost, I mean, when Microsoft issues a patch and 1 million companies have to apply it, what is that economic burden? It's substantial. It's way more than what Microsoft is investing. Like, no one's really done that math.
Right, and it doesn't seem that Microsoft has a liability or risk that is confirmed.
I think software security, I wouldn't say from a regulatory standpoint, I like the concept of software liability when I'm buying something. I mean, when's the last time you spent 6 figures on anything and you didn't get some kind of warranty? There's only 2 that I'm aware of, security and software. It's the weirdest thing. I guess religion, too. Kind of the same. It's strange.
Anyone else?
Yes.
All right, hold. Let me get you mic'd up here. There you go. Thank you.
I was wondering if you ever looked at, you've been talking a lot about information security, but how does that relate, the cost versus the impact and the likelihood? Isn't that roughly similar to physical security and what the investments that banks have made and fences and perimeter defenses and things like that?
Oh, yeah. I think, if we could reduce it to like an engineering discipline, these cost modeling, like this bridge can only withstand a load of this amount, and if it breaks, then it's going to cost us this much. Unfortunately, we don't yet have the engineering rigor to test the resiliency of software. Like, we can't even predict when we can deliver software on time. Like, if anything's over 10 million lines of code, no one can even predict when it lands, let alone what you can stress it to. But I like the idea. Like, I was taking before I moved from California, I was taking pilot training, and reading through all the FAA reports, and they have very detailed records. They have checklists on what works and what doesn't work. I think if we take a more FAA type of approach to software security, we'll be in a much better place, but it's going to take us a while to get there. We don't even know all the knobs yet.
So, Jerimiah, are you contemplating opening a home in Hawaii for disgruntled and freaked out InfoSec professionals?
I find the best place to contemplate InfoSec matters is on the beach, yeah. So.
Any other questions? Okay, I think
Thank you, everybody, for your time. Hope you got something out of it. Really appreciate it. Thank you.